Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Narratives in Board Games panel. I'm John Coxon. I'm on this panel because I kept saying to the other people running this convention, please can I do a panel on narratives in board games because I really like it. And they kept saying, maybe. And then eventually I nagged them until they said yes. I still can't emote too much. My co-panelists are Pat, Andrew, and Esther. So let's go in alphabetical order. Andrew, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Andrew. I'm a keen board game player and also board game designer.
Esther?
Hello, I am Esther McCallum-Stewart. I am an associate professor of games, which is amazing because I'm an ass prof. I'm hoping soon to become a prof, but that will need more work. But only the humble ass right now.
Excellent. And then Pat.
Hi, I'm Pat. I'm basically a games player. I didn't even know about narrative games until John invited me on this panel. I looked them up and I thought, oh, those are the sort of games I like to play. So I am basically everyman.
So, and this kind of gets into the first question I want to ask, and the reason that I think it's important to have people who play games who are not as into the genres as the people who discuss them a lot. So what the first thing we should do is define all the nouns in the panel title. Before we read the panel description, you've got to define your nouns. So narratives, we know what they are. Great. Tabletop, something to do with tables. Grand. Games. Okay, things you play. But what is that getting at? And the first question I have is, I think we had a brief conversation before the panel started about emergent narratives versus kind of dictated narratives. Does anyone want to kind of talk a little bit about games that do either of those and what the core differences between those are as a way to get us into talking about what we're talking about?
Oh, I'd say let's go with Andrew as the designer.
Yeah.
Voluntold.
Run away. So I guess, as John kind of mentioned there, you've got these two different experiences. One where there is a narrative that has a particular arc and particular beats that the game designers wanted to get across to you, versus something that is emergent where it puts a bunch of systems in place and it might put a bunch of like mini scenarios in place, but those scenarios aren't tied together with a narrative structure necessarily.
Yeah. And I think for me, the key difference in terms of what you have in front of you and what you're playing is a narrative-driven game will deliberately push story at you. It doesn't matter where that is. That might be a bit of text on a card. It might be the description of what you're doing. It might be the whole thing. The whole thing might be some form of story that you're engaging with. Whereas more emergent, the players make the story. So the players start to create a story that perhaps isn't necessarily there, but the game lends itself to. So maybe it's got like a really vibrant setting, or maybe it's just really, it's got things in it that make you want to tell stories, that make you want to think about things.
Yeah, I think that's Paul, Pat.
I was going to say I came to board gaming relatively late, only about 20 years ago in my 30s. And I found there were certain types of games I played. And one of the examples I can think of, which is one of the earliest games I engaged with, was the Downfall of Pompeii, where the story is first about inhabiting Pompeii, and then once Vesuvius explodes, evacuating Pompeii. So, it's a very simple story, but it was, a flow, a narrative message, something that was happening,
Yeah, and I think so. I think something that I've written in the blurb is that traditionally tabletop games have really focused on that emergent style of storytelling. So if you go back to kind of like maybe not Carcassonne, although I think there is like some emergent narrative there, but especially Settlers of Catan, which is one of the kind of first the early games that began the kind of modern renaissance in board gaming, probably. You have a kind of narrative around the contest to settle this island. So Pat mentioned Pompeii. For you, Andrew and Esther, like, what was the game that you first kind of fell in love with because it let you tell stories as opposed to just having kind of interesting mechanics?
I don't think. Go on, you first.
So I think it's quite late in my board game playing history that I fell in love with the game for those reasons, and it'll probably be Pandemic Legacy.
Okay.
I think the board game groups that I play with don't tend to be people who develop particularly strong kind of emergent narratives out of the game, right? And so it wasn't until Pandemic Legacy which kind of started introducing some more of that, like direct narrative structures in like how the game and the campaign plays out, that we found ourselves starting to do that more as we were playing that game. Like, so for me, Pandemic Legacy wasn't just this is a game about the game having a narrative it wants to tell me. That also then led to me and my gaming group developing more emergent narrative because we're kind of more in that mindset.
There's an absolutely brilliant GDC online talk, which again I will try and find the links for, but I've got a meeting immediately after this, so it might have to wait, with Matt Leacock and Rob Daviau, who are the two developers, talking about some of the things that they did in it. And one of the things that they did in order to engage with emergent narrative, and it's so simple, and once you realize it, you're like, that's genius, is that when they created the characters, they left a blank space for their names. So the player adds the names in. And I think I mentioned this in the paper that I gave earlier. I've done like a whole lecture on Pandemic because it's a huge, like, for me, it was actually Pandemic rather than Pandemic Legacy, which is the sort of turn by turn one where things change on the board. But one of the best moments that we've had playing it, and I'm playing with one person, can't play with them at the moment, is naming those characters. And there are two in particular that I can kind of tell. We tell a lot of stories about these characters when we're talking to each other. So we have one character who is, I believe it's either the scientist or the researcher, I can't remember, but it's a picture of a woman. And on the box, on the original box, she really reminds me of Beverly Crusher. And when we started to play this time, we had this doctor, and I was like, well, we can't call her Dr. Crusher, that's crap and boring. So we've called her Dr. Cutter. So I believe she must be, so I don't know, maybe she's a medic, I can't remember because she cuts things. But we also decided that because she was so serious and she was so into stuff and she kind of gets the job done, she doesn't have a first name. All of the other characters have got first names, just Dr. Cutter. And the other one was the quarantine specialist. And the quarantine specialist is a black character. She's a woman. And we took her out of the box. And this one, you're going to know the answer because when I did the recording for this earlier this week, we couldn't remember. So she looks like the woman in Black Panther, who is the scientist, who's the younger sister, who's the one who's going to become allegedly going to become the new Black Panther. What's her name? I know what her name in game.
Shuri.
Yes, Shuri in game. What's the actress's name? Can anyone remember?
Oh.
No.
Okay. So we looked at her and I'm like, she looks like Shuri out of Black Panther. So we're going to give her a name. What are we going to give her? So we decided we're going to give her a pun. There's nothing like a good pun. So we've called her Sure Effect.
Oh.
She gets the job done because she's the quarantine expert.
Yeah.
That's a really, really good example of something so simple as leaving a name blank. This entire story comes through it. This stupid pun, Dr. Cutter. We've got another guy who's ended up called Dr. Eggs for, it's not even his name. All these things kind of become like they really embed themselves into the game. And I think it's a masterpiece of design. Like I really do. I love Matt Leacock games, but particularly that one, I think. So hard agree, Andrew.
The season 2 goes further and leaves the name of places blank, and so we use that to carry over stories, and like we name places after events that happened in our first season to kind of carry that narrative arc through, which is very nice.
So cool. I
That's
didn't know
awesome.
that. Yeah.
I haven't played season 1 or season 2, but I haven't played season 1. But I think leaving the names blank is a really perceptive thing to pick up on. And I think I have one friend who I love dearly, but he is, I will say, I think mechanically focused when it comes to board games. And the best example of this is if there is a game where the name is blank, he'll just put the first noun that comes into his head, and that's it. And that's always it. There's no thought about the character at all. And I think about it. I mean, maybe not lots, but and I think it's not only is it a good way to let people kind of take ownership of the narrative, but also if someone looks at that and then says, I don't want to do that, it's a really good indicator that perhaps for them, the narrative is not the important part of the game, which I entirely respect, but clashes. And obviously not the precursor to Pandemic Legacy necessarily, but the first time I saw a group of people really investing in that kind of building a story was Risk Legacy, where you kind of had your kind of global conflicts, and then your board represented the stories you had told when you were unfolding that. And I thought at the time that was really good.
So there's a really, really fascinating story about Risk Legacy. And again, apologies if it's on this video that I will link, where Rob Daviau, no, it can't be. This must have been something that I saw him speak about. So apparently he'd been working for Hasbro or Mattel, I can't remember which one, for ages and ages. And he kept saying, I want to do this game where you destroy the cards and you destroy pieces and the map changes. And everyone was like, you must be joking. Like, no way. No one's going to want to play this. It's completely, it's a stupid idea. Who wants to play a game that is going to be destroyed at the end? And he was like, push, 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 push. And there was a management shift at whichever company it was. And at the same time, he was working on a bunch of Cluedos. So he was working on Harry Potter Cluedo, which is really weird that all the walls shift, and it's kind of got all these kind of weird, crazy mechanics. But of course, anything with HP on it, unfortunately, still really sells. So company very excited. Company have just had a really, really big shift in management, so they don't really know him. And he's like, oh yeah, and there's this other game that I've been developing for a while, and it's going to come along with that, and it's a Risk game, and Risk is our other really big property. So hey, Harry Potter, really good, blah, 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 blah. Oh, and yeah, and this as well. Yeah, I've been working on it for quite a long time, so it's ready.
Amazing.
And that's how he got it in. And then of course it was a really, really big hit. But they've been resisting it for absolutely years. Did not think that this kind of game would have any kind of currency with players. So yeah, really fascinating.
I think for me, personally, the game I first played with the emergent narrative was, has anyone here played World at War?
No.
Has anyone here played Axis and Allies?
Yeah.
So Axis and Allies, for those in the audience who are unfamiliar, is a World War II board game. And there are multiple different editions. The one we used to play is a world map, and you have 5 players who take on the different powers in World War II. And you play out kind of 1938-ish up to, well, however far you get. World at War is a version of that adds a lot of rules, like a lot of rules. There are rules to decide which French territories kind of go kind of Free France or Vichy France or kind of stuff like that. And as the... I can't remember, I think I was playing England, but it might not have been. But basically, one of the players controls France as well as controlling a different faction, because obviously France... in most cases doesn't really, a lot of their territory falls to Germany. But I lucked out in that South Africa didn't. It stayed Free French. I think it was South Africa. I built a port there. And fast forward to 1945, France is the major allied power fighting the Pacific War. Australia hasn't at all got involved. America is really focused on Germany because France has just taken the Pacific off them. They don't need to worry about the Pacific. France is on it. And that was like the first thing where we completely rewrote World War II, where France just turned into this massive naval superpower like over the course of 5 years. And it was just, that feeling of creating that story. And no one, I explain this, and obviously, like, I know you tell stories about games and people are like, oh, that's nice, dear. And I get it. But like, for me, like, there's 4 other people for whom that story like really resonates, and I love it.
Yeah.
Pat, I feel like so you kind of talking about Pompeii. Are there any other games kind of, because we've been talking about, I guess, more recent games. So is there anything kind of that you've come across more recently that has?
Well, a lot of it is about the people you play games with, and moved around a lot as a child. But the one game I did like that we tried to fairly regularly do with cousins or whatever was Colditz, which actually I might be a case for a very early board game with a narrative. You know, the story. I kind of feel I don't need to explain Colditz. So basically, it's a board game. You got Germans, you got 4 or 5 different varieties of prisoners, Russians and English and French, all with slightly different skills and abilities and things you can get. And it's actually kind of a very open-ended game with a lot you can do with it, you know. And the basic idea is to escape. So there was a story in that. It was probably, as a teenager, as a child, it was probably one of the more common games I played. I wanted to make sure I'm not making that up, but I'm sure it was a 60s game.
Okay. So when I said more modern, you've gone very much the other way, which I enjoy.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got rattled and said the first thing that came into my head.
No.
73, so not that old.
Okay. All right. I would have been, when that came out, I would have been 11. So, yeah, all right. That was probably mostly teenage years rather than younger than that. I think before that, it would have been, board games in my youth were things like Monopoly and Snakes and Ladders and all the usual ones, you know. Quite envious of kids growing up surrounded by all these wonderful games. But, let's see. I want to think of, the one with the power stations. Power, is that called?
Power Grid?
Power Station? Grid? Yes, Power Up. I don't know. I don't actually own it because I haven't played it for a while, but...
I think we know the one you mean. We'll post links in the Discord at the end of the panel.
Yes, I think it'll be googly to try and remember.
It's the one that's got meeples of barrels of oil and
Power Grid.
Yeah, it's Power Grid. Yeah,
that's it. Power Grid. Yeah. I've really enjoyed that as well. I think that the games you play depend a lot on the people you play them with, and I tend to play with the same group of people. We're all a bit scattered at the moment, you know, in Hertfordshire and London and what have you. But generally, this group tended to go for casual players, or those hours-long werewolf games, which are just too. I find I can play roughly an hour of werewolf before I need to go sit in the corner and be quiet by myself.
Fair enough.
We've been talking to the students about this because, again, as I said in my previous talk, the demographic for buying board games is actually slightly older than the average student, so it's 25 and upwards, which is interesting, but not this kind of topic. But we've tried where possible to avoid making comparisons with kind of video games to keep them away from that. But the really obvious one for that is Among Us. Among Us is basically 5-minute werewolf, with trapdoors. And it's really interesting to see this game suddenly become super popular online, and there's loads of playthroughs, and the students absolutely love it. They all sort of bundle off and play it for, again, hours and hours and hours. It's essentially werewolf. Yeah, it's werewolf quick.
Well, and it's in, I think part of the reason it's taken off so much in lockdown is because in a physical game that's a social deduction game, you're taking a lot from the players you're with, their body language and the stuff they're not saying out loud. Whereas with Among Us, what you're mostly taking is where there is a virtual world that replaces that in a way that I think makes it a lot more possible to play it virtually. But I think it's
one of the things that you have to do in Among Us, for those of you who haven't played it, you're on a space station and you're running around and somebody's the murderer and they murder people. But the people who aren't the murderer have to perform special tasks. And only the people who aren't the murderer can see where those tasks are. So one of the things that the murderer has to do is fake it by running up to these task stations and pretending to do tasks. And then when they're called on it, they have to say, "Oh, well, I was in electric doing the puzzle there, or I was downloading some files." And one of the ways to catch people out is that. And yeah, it's as you say, John, it's like a really interesting replacement for the physicality of the shifty eye or the card tell or whatever it is. So yeah.
Well, one of the things that mostly as a teenager, I played computer games of various sorts, particularly The Hobbit and Valhalla and other stories like that. And I looked at board games, and I thought of board games as Cluedo or Monopoly, something that you played and you were done, you're going away. We are talking late 70s sort of thing, and I persisted with those sort of computer games right up to EQ2. I had about zero interest in playing things like Doom or anything that I thought of as just a fairly simple game. EQ2, EverQuest 2, persistent world, changing actions, all that sort of thing, long stories. And it wasn't until quite late that I found that there were narrative games, starting with Pompeii, where you get the same sort of long-term engagement in a board game.
Yeah, and I think this I think is, so we spent about kind of 20 minutes talking about emergent narratives, and I think emergent narratives are a super important part of kind of storytelling, for me anyway. But I think in the last, and I'm gonna say decade, and we can argue about that if people disagree, but I think in about the last decade there's been a shift, or maybe not a shift, but an evolution in that we've seen more games that set out to tell stories rather than setting out to kind of create these emergent narratives. And the first one I came across was a 2008 release by Fantasy Flight Games. And I think, argue quite strongly that Fantasy Flight Games are one of the companies that's been really pushing this as an idea. And the game is Android. So Android is a cyberpunk board game, and it aims to tell the story of a murder. And the murder does change every time, so it's not quite as directed as some of the games I think we'll come on to, but it is kind of more directed than a lot of the games we've been discussing. And I think, for me, that had a really nice blend of the emergent narrative and the directed narrative. And for those who haven't played it, you're traveling around New Angeles, which is a city on the equator, the home to the beanstalk, which goes up to the moon, obviously. And you're not trying to find out who the murderer is. You're trying to make sure the person you think is the murderer is the one that is convicted. Yeah. Which is a very important difference.
Yes, it really is.
Yes. And for me, that was like my first experience. But like, so I think everyone here has played the more directed narrative games. So for you, what was your first introduction to that kind of approach? Yes, start with Pat.
Okay, so I'm gonna put up Zombies as an early candidate. That's the Zombies with the 3 exclamation marks.
Yeah.
Zombies.
Basically, in itself, it's basically a tile-based game. And it's kind of zombies, and it's kind of a very zombie-like story. Didn't get to play it a lot because not everybody's keen on zombies, especially people I'm married to. But then they went on to release, I've just checked, there's something like 17 or 18 expansions, which basically expanded the story and added a military base and a school and all sorts of things. So that was kind of a very narrative game. And that's a really early one as well. I'm sorry, the delights of Google, I've just looked it up. The original version came out in 2001. So, but
wow.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Esther?
Yeah. I just kind of thought through a few. I kind of my went down a different route there because I was thinking it's really interesting that we're also talking about roguelike games. Games where you put tiles down and the map generates itself. So I think we mentioned Carcassonne earlier. I've always had a really strong connection with games that I can personally identify with, and so going to Carcassonne in the actual place and spending a day there made it more of a immersive experience for me. And that was really interesting because it's not a game that I'd usually play. Pretty much every single shop in Carcassonne sells Carcassonne, as you might expect.
I mean, it's not often that the free market works, but when it does, you can't.
It's amazing.
What a great souvenir, huh?
But yeah, I think for me, there's a bit of a difference between growing up with games where I forced narrative onto them because I was bored, and games that I played that definitely did have some kind of story. Interestingly, a whole raft of zombie games. Zombies are always kind of up and down. It's like, bored of zombies, let's have Cthulhu. Bored of Cthulhu, let's have some zombies. But
you can throw Sherlock in the mix now.
Yes.
We're gonna get there, Pat. We're gonna get there.
It's okay.
Andrew.
We can make it. So I'm finding it quite difficult, and also I think you might be able to see me doing this on camera. I'm kind of thinking of like, should I just sneak off and go and look at my board game shelf? Because like, the moment I go and look at it, I'm just going to be like, oh, for God's sake! Like, of course, one game that I find that has a directed narrative that's a really simple directed narrative that gets me every time is Takenoko. So in Takenoko, you are building actually there's two that are very similar but different in terms of the description. You are building a pleasure garden for the emperor, and the emperor has hired a very hardworking gardener, and the gardener is very keen on making the garden grow big and strong. But unfortunately, there's a pesky panda in the garden as well, and the panda wants to do nothing but eat things. And that is the story. That's it. The game is kind of more about building things up and building things down and moving things along hexes. But I always find, because of the way that game is designed, it's very cartoony. It's explained with this long cartoon, which is a bit annoying because the rules kind of aren't very well explained. But the directed narrative there is super simple. Panda, jerk, gardener, emperor wants a lovely garden. But actually, that's a really, really strong narrative, and I think it doesn't have to be like a super, super developed story for you to start actually telling your own stories. So I don't have Takenoko in my house at the moment, but pro tip: if anyone does have Takenoko in the house, go and get it, take out the gardener, and then have a look at the insert box, because it's the most unfortunate molding. It looks like a penis.
Esther.
So it looks like a little penis in the molding, and every time I've shown it to someone, they're like,
and that is emergent narrative.
This is why I study games for a living, to be able to say, hey, look, this, yeah.
Excellent.
Okay.
Totally good.
Bums.
Andrew, what was your first kind of more directed game?
I think as a kind of a stepping stone to like something that is a direct narrative would be Dead of Winter, which has
listener Joe pointed that out in the chat. So Dead of Winter is a good show.
Yeah. So for people that don't know how it works, there'll be someone when you take your turn, someone else will draw a card, and it will have a trigger written on that card. And if you happen to trigger it, then there's a bit of story that happens, and then a decision you have to make, and that has consequences, like mechanical consequences within the game. And so, some of those, because it uses those triggers, some of those are able to tell actual proper stories with arcs. So because it could just so happen that in this particular game you have the teacher that goes to the school, and someone's pulled out that card that says when the teacher's in the school, something happens, and so that really, for me, kind of draws you into some of the storytelling there.
And it feels really accidental because there's so many characters in it as well,
right.
like including a drunk Santa. So it's got these wonderful little dips in it. But yeah, sorry, I interrupted you.
That's all right. But I think probably the first game I played that had like a full story that it wanted to tell me would be Pandemic Legacy.
Okay. And I think, sorry, Pat.
I was going to mention that Graham Head has mentioned Cosmic Encounter in the chat, and that's kind of sparked off a whole bunch of other older games which had a story, often based on a story, like Dune or Dragon Riders of Pern or Civilization, which was wasn't that based on a book, or maybe the book was based on that. I can't remember, but
there's a bunch of different ones. One that was actually based on Civilization, the game, so it might be that one. But there's a couple of different versions of, excuse me, a game called Civilization.
Yeah, but I used to have half a dozen of these old Avalon Hill style boxes, so those sorts of games.
Yeah.
So there have been people who wanted to tell stories in games for a long time, I think.
Well, and they have, and I think so. Two of the games. So I mentioned Android and Dead of Winter came up, and another game that got mentioned has completely left my head. The original edition, no one actually mentioned this, but I'm just obsessed. It's the second edition of Arkham Horror, which came out in 2005. Mm-hmm. I think all of these are games that incorporated storytelling elements. But what I will say is that in more recent years, I've played games that tell more directed stories. And having gone back since then and played Arkham Second Edition, played Android, and played Dead of Winter, I have found myself thinking, oh, I played this before I had played a game that had managed to do this well. And these games were doing a great job at the kind of vanguard of this movement. And now I play them and I'm like, they have aged quite a lot in light of the fact that we have kind of come quite a long way in this space since then. And especially Arkham Horror Second Edition, I find... But even in Dead of Winter, every time a Crossroads card doesn't trigger at the end of the round, I find myself thinking, but I'm missing out on story here, and I don't need to be. And that frustrates me deeply. And I think two games that have come out more recently that are doing narrative very, very well are Arkham Horror the card game, which 3/4 of this panel are huge fans of, and and Seventh Continent. Game. And so does anyone on the panel want to talk about either or both of those games? Andrew, do you want to go first and defend your decision not to like good board games, sir?
Wow. Umbrella with that shade, moderator.
So I've been thinking about this a lot. I think our problem, I played them with my wife Emily, and we didn't get on with either game. And I think our problem with them were that those games have failure built into the experience. Yeah. They're designed to be hard, and you play and you fail and you go, almost got it, I'm going to try again. We're just not the people that get on with that sort of thing.
Which is entirely fair.
Yeah.
So that was a question that I had, I guess, for the other panel. Like, is that for these games that have such a directed narrative, is that kind of a prerequisite to making those work and making them be replayable, or are there ways of doing that without designing failure into the experience?
Oh, that is a great question.
So yeah, so one of the things that I will say about the fail mode in Arkham Horror is that the basic decks that it provides you with are meant to show you what the character can do. They're not very good for play. And I'm not somebody who likes putting together big packs of new characters and decks. And in fact, they've just released one. I'm guessing that's what Pat just held up. They've actually released some more characters which have got custom decks that were meant to be a bit more successful playing. But when we started playing, the first time that I played with a different group of people, and I didn't enjoy it. I was playing an orphan character who I didn't like very much, and their powers just felt really all over the place. And it wasn't until I actually played with somebody who's really into assembling decks and sat down and spent the time looking stuff up online and said, look, I think you're going to really enjoy playing this character. Is it okay if I build this for you? And I said, yes, that I succeeded. And I think that's a fail mode. That's a design fail, because if you have to take the game apart, look online and get someone else to put your character deck together for you because the one that is provided doesn't work, bad, bad, bad news. So whilst I love Arkham Horror and I've played multiple story arcs on it, I think I've played the first 3 expansions, all of which are about 6 games long. I just think that's really bad design. The other thing that, as kind of, again, Andrew, I think probably you will also have things to say about, it specifically says you need 2 copies of the base game to play successfully. That's bullshit. Like, I want to play, this is a 20, this was a 28, £35 game. Hang on a minute, I've got to buy 2 of them? No?
So,
yeah, go on.
I can talk for a long time about that, and I think we'll get distracted, but I think I'm going to let Pat go.
Okay, you know what? Esther's criticisms are entirely fair. I absolutely guarantee you that where half a dozen people are gathered together to discuss Arkham Horror, the dreadful "you have to buy two base games" thing will come up, and it really is. They'd be much better off charging 70 quid and giving out a double pack. But I need to cut in because I think that's wrong. Because the reason I don't play Star Wars Armada is because the base game costs 80 quid. X-Wing costs 20 quid. They end up costing the same over time, but that, especially if you're an undergraduate, I didn't have 80 quid when I was a student. I had 20. I strongly think that this is quite a privileged position. Another more interesting point. My more interesting point is that I don't think Arkham Horror is 1 game. I think it's 2 games. And those 2 games can appeal to different people. The first game is that making the deck, the research, the looking at what other people have done, the reading other people's. That's actually a game in itself. And if you've played anything like Magic or Poker, not that I have, but it's exactly that sort of collector thing. And I've got like 5,000 cards here, and I spend more time thinking about the game than I do playing it by a long shot. So that is actually part of the game experience for me. Then every now and again, when I'm not completely busy or stressed, I set it up and I actually play out one of those decks on the game. But I spend a lot more time in the first game than in the second game.
I think that's also fair, and it kind of speaks to the one of the ways that, again, I try to sort of describe it to students is I call it the cinema experience. So if you're going to go to the cinema in an evening, you pay for the travel to get there. Obviously, not now. You pay for the travel to get there. You pay for your ticket. You probably pay for some food. You feel a bit decadent about that. You might go to the pub afterwards. You've spent £30 min having a lovely evening. A board game, as Pat says, there's a lot of kind of extra currency in that. But I also completely sympathise with that doesn't necessarily mean you immediately have £70. I think, the discussion of prices in games is slightly off topic, but it is a really interesting one. And there's all these kind of,
and I think there is a real psychological gut punch to having to buy the second core, and I do bloody hell, webcam, come on, and I really do sympathise with that because I get why it feels horrible, it really does, and I completely agree. But I do think there's the flip side, which is it also feels horrible to drop 80 quid on a game. I'm going to move on because I'm well aware that I could talk about Arkham Horror, the card game, for an hour.
Can we talk about Gloomhaven?
Yes. So I was gonna mention Gloomhaven and other games.
Don't lose Seventh Continent.
So I'm going to come back to Gloomhaven. Should we talk about Seventh Continent and then Gloomhaven? Oh, Esther looks sad.
So that will give other people a chance to talk. So yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Andrew, do you want to... So I think you bought Seventh Continent after bouncing off Arkham Horror, the card game, quite hard. So do you want to tell us about your experiences with the 2 and kind of why Seventh Continent might be more your cup of tea?
I don't think it is. Oh
man, twist.
Well, I think it's the same thing, right? In that it's another game where failure is a part of the experience, and it's a hard game. I talk to people and they're like, oh, I've played it a whole bunch, I've not won it yet, but I've almost won a scenario, which is a great experience if you're into that sort of a thing. But I think it's also my problem is that the rules aren't very well written, so it took us a while to figure out what we're doing, and while we're trying to battle against the rules, we're also battling against the hard game. So that didn't help.
Steep learning curves.
Yeah, Pat, have you played Seventh Continent?
Yep, it's probably my second favorite game, which puts me in a different place from Ander. I must one of the big values, and this has been really useful during lockdown, is that both these games are big games that take up a lot of time, but they're also games you can play solo, basically you against the game, rather than In fact, they're better played solo because there's such long, persistent games that getting a group to play them regularly,
Yeah. Oh, and I think the disadvantage that both Seventh Continent and Arkham have is that they are games that require multiple plays, and you have to have a dedicated group. And on the subject of games that enthusiastically embrace that as a concept, let's talk about Gloomhaven.
Yes.
So I've only recently been playing Gloomhaven, but I played Imperial Assault, which is a sort of Star Wars-y game which shares some similarities by Fantasy Flight. And there's a game called Descent, which is a dungeon crawler that kind of shares some DNA from back in 2007, I want to say, although that is a guess, so please don't quote me. But Esther is taking us on a tour of her house to the Gloomhaven shelf.
To the Gloomhaven shelf. Okay,
Yes.
so this is my hand, and this is my hand in it, and this is Gloomhaven.
The box is huge and it weighs a ton.
So the box weighs nearly 8 kilograms, and as you can see, one of the things that I've had to do is I've had to take it all out and put it into these fishing boxes.
Yeah, fishing boxes for the win.
Fishing boxes for the win. So not only is it absolutely gigantic, but also, let me come back into the other room. There's a tour of my house. There's my lovely plant.
Yay, plant.
Back through. I'm not going to tell Alexa to do anything. Alexa, make it so. I am Captain. Yes. I like Alexa. So this is also...
All right.
I live on my own. What can I say? Okay,
Yep.
so this is how far I've played in Gloomhaven so far. These are all of the destroyed cards that I have. And I have kept them. And you can actually see I've also marked on them. You see that X there. That shows what action we took in these cards. And if it's got a little picture of a tear there, it shows you that you need to tear the card up. The reason that I've kept these is I actually I went to a friend's house and she'd framed her Pandemic Legacy game. And all of the cards and all the decisions they've made.
That's nice.
Yes. And it looked amazing.
Yeah.
So the thing about Gloomhaven is this massive game. It's modular. It looks like a really old-fashioned simulation game. It's got all these hexes. It's got hundreds of people that you put together. It's got all these characters. And it is unbelievably character-driven. It manages, again, with tiny descriptions and a lot of kind of little flavor text things to create this incredibly immersive world that you are literally just playing a dungeon crawl. You have to go and kill the baddies and that's it. And there's a scenario. And there's stories that carry all the way through it. I think there's 117 individual scenarios that you can play. And we've played about 50 of them so far. And it's not my kind of game. I don't like fiddly games where you've got lots of powers, where you're not quite sure what you're supposed to be doing all the time, and the rules take ages. In order to understand the rules, and again, this is a kind of pro tip, if you're not understanding the rules of something, go and watch playthroughs online. Go and watch trained webcasters show you how to play the game. So I watched a 17-minute how-to, and I thought, wow, this looks really interesting, but I need to watch a playthrough. And I watched a 3-hour playthrough. And it was mesmerizing. And I was like, this is my kind of not really D&D. And then I ended up playing this. I've played 2 characters so far. Again, I love puns. So I played a character called Freefall. And Freefall had a familiar, which was an owl. So she was Freefall Owl. Freefall Owl. Yeah, still doesn't really work when you say it. Free for all. But I've also got a character at the moment called Door. Door doesn't really, they're people.
Excellent.
Yeah, and they work on the door. So that's what people call them. They're a bouncer and they work in the tavern, and the tavern is kind of a character in the game. And it's just mesmerizingly fun. I absolutely love it. I'm playing it with 2 different groups. I'm playing it with my partner, which is a real shame because we've got so far we can't recreate the online version. But I'm also playing with another group of people, again in Dublin, unfortunately. And I just, despite its cost, despite its weight, I've absolutely fallen for this game. I just find, and despite its difficulty as well, this isn't this is not a game that you'd ever say to a beginner, "Oh, hey, how about Gloomhaven?" They'd just be like, "No." It would be kind of the antithesis of everything that I teach, and I love it. I adore it. It's so fun. I love the world. I love my characters. I'm sad they die. They can die and retire. It's brilliant. So,
excellent.
I'm done.
Pat and Andrew, have you played Gloomhaven?
I haven't played it.
I have a copy of it, which I've taken out of the box and looked at and thought, oh my God, there's so much work in this. And put it back in the box and didn't manage to get it all back in.
Yep.
The box, my box is about that much at the bottom, where the top overlaps the bottom. There's about that much space. I keep looking at it and thinking, now that we're in lockdown, I should drag it out, and and this looks like a game that both of us would get into, So
just to give this game a bit of context about the sort of amazing hype of it. At the beginning of lockdown, the sequel was in Kickstarter, and it sold 83,100 copies. This is this crazy board game phenomenon. But I agree with you. I saw a picture of somebody else's board game shelves recently, and lo and behold, sadly at the top there was an obviously unopened copy of Gloomhaven. It's like doing a D&D campaign. I think you don't start a D&D campaign without thinking that you're going to spend probably one night a week working on it, and it is work too. And that's a big difference. That's a really brave step in gaming, to be like, okay, this isn't just every 2 or 3 months we'll get it out and play it with friends. This is it describes itself as a campaign, and it uses that language for it. So
yeah. And so I'm going to say just 2 very quick things before I start taking questions from the chat, which is, firstly, I have also played Gloomhaven. It's pretty good. I haven't fallen in love with it the way a lot of the community has. I do enjoy it. It's a bit too, for me, it's not quite enough narrative. It's a bit too hack and slash and a bit not narrative enough. And secondly, I can only think of one game other than, or kind of maybe one game is as unfair. No, it is unfair. Ignore me. I'm not going to make that point. Abandon ship. Okay, so we're going to move on to questions from the audience. So one question we got quite early on is, do you find it difficult playing in a narrative where there's a right answer and you create a version of events that might not be the right answer? So I guess one example would be like playing World War II games where you know how World War II turns out. So like you are by definition creating a parallel universe. But I'm thinking the example that comes to mind is actually a video game, Dawn of War 2, where you could choose any path you wanted through the game. But when the sequel came out, it's like, no, this was the correct one. And then, well, okay, but what? So how do you all feel about that?
I'm entirely okay with that, I'm a fan of alternate history. If World War II turns out differently, I think World War II has turned out differently. If I play a computer game, especially something like Skyrim or something, I might go off and do something completely different from killing the dragon, like maybe collecting all the cutlery in the entire game, which is something I did once, but we will go there. So I'm okay with making my own narratives.
Okay.
So, Andrew, do you want to? Because I've got an academic take on this one.
I haven't played a lot of games where, to take that first example of alternate history, I imagine I would be fine with it. I think my understanding of like the wargaming scene, that's kind of the point of it, is to see like, if the inputs have been different, if different decisions have been made, like how might things have turned out. I think that's kind of interesting, kind of cool, and you can get some lovely stories out of that. I think taking that second example where you've invested in the story, and then a sequel comes out and says that story no longer is no longer the timeline that we're following. I think that would be quite jarring. I think to take it on from the board game world, I think Pandemic Legacy Season 2 does a good job of like setting enough distance that you can see how you got from anybody's playthrough of Season 1 to the start of Season 2.
Yeah. You've made me want to play it, actually, because I've seen the board and thought, no.
No, it's good.
So there's a sort of big games theory around this, and it expands into video games as well. And it uses the term agency, which is basically how much power you have to control your own destiny. And ultimately, you don't. You don't have any control whatsoever in games because they're all set. You can do as many random things as you want. As Pat says, you can collect all the cutlery in Skyrim, and there is an emergent aspect of that. But ultimately, you still have to do the same quests. You may do them in a completely arbitrary order, and you still reach the same conclusion at the end of the game. Now, I've never finished Skyrim because I'm not very interested in that story, but it doesn't still mean that all those things are predetermined. And the same is true in board games. But the hint is, and Skyrim is used as an example of this a lot, and as is The Last of Us, is making the reader or making the player or making the gamer or the board gamer think that they are able to make their own choices, and allowing them just enough freedom to feel like they're kind of, having fun and they're not being pushed in a certain direction. You don't have to win World War II in the way that it says, yeah, you can. France can conquer the seas from a small port in South Africa. And again, a good example of this not working very well was the end of The Last of Us, which I'm not going to spoil, but the kind of key thing that happens at the end is that you can't make a choice in what happens. And that really upset a lot of people because they felt that they'd gone through a quite open game and then reached the end and they were like, okay, this happens because this is the conclusion. So suddenly everything felt really forced for them. I like the end of The Last of Us. I think it's an absolutely classic game and I really love the second one, but that's beside the point. And I think games do the same. A game that makes you feel like Arkham Horror, like Gloomhaven, sounds like Seventh Continent, does it to an extent, but is kind of a little bit too hard, is make you feel like the choices that you're making are important. And there's a difference there between important and directed, because if your choices are worthwhile, it doesn't matter that the end is still going to be the same. So that's the sort of that's the sort of academic circle on that. Having said that, that is definitely my opinion as an academic, and I've written about that, and it is not one that is shared by other academics. So if that is something that you are interested in, again, I have a meeting after this, but I can give you links to read about stuff like that. And lots of people arguing very energetically about it. So yeah.
Excellent. We've got another question, which is, has a board game narrative ever moved you to tears or changed your outlook or had like a profound effect on you? I'm trying to think. So the only example I can think of this in any games is the end of Horizon Zero Dawn on PlayStation 4, which I was really moved by. But I can't think of any board games that have done it. Oh, sorry. You go.
Yeah, go on, Andrew.
I was going to say, I haven't played it, so I can't say how effective it is, but I think Holding On, The Troubled Life of Billy Kerr is attempting to do that and to tell a story that is designed to move you and make you feel and think about your attitudes towards death.
Yeah. And I think Andrew's kind of sort of hit the nail on the head there. There's quite a lot of games that try and do it. Whether or not they succeed, slightly different thing. I've written a paper about a bunch of games that are about trying to understand love. And if you think about that in terms of board game mechanics, it suddenly becomes really weird. Interestingly, 3 of the games that I looked at involve not communicating, so not touching or not being able to talk or not being able to... the other person has to make your moves for you. So this whole idea of like, oh, hey, love, it's all about communication suddenly goes out the window because it's all about like you can eyeball your like the person that you're playing with and hope they do the right thing. There's a game called Fog of Love, which I run and get it. So
no, we've got 4 minutes.
It's about role-playing relationships, but it's a comedy. And I think what they've tried to do is, so you get given, you are role playing. Yeah, go on, John. You explain it.
And it does. So I wasn't necessarily going to explain it, but that is actually a game that did move me because I felt really invested in my character, and so I'm glad you mentioned it because I completely forgot that was a game that did move me.
So what happens in the game is that you're given a character, so you're not role playing yourself. That's really important, and that character has various different flaws and kind of positives and negatives. So perhaps you have to role play being a bit anxious, but having said that, you're actually really self-confident. So you get given these things that you have to do, and then you have to role play your way through various different situations. And I know, like, I know at least one person who said, I want to use this with my partner because my partner struggles with understanding interpersonal relationships, and I want to help them, but without criticizing them. So yeah, there's definitely games there. I think this is another one of these kind of, there's games for everything. They're not always super successful in the same way that a lot of games aren't always successful, you know. So yeah.
And actually, one thing I will say is I've played a couple of micro RPGs, which also really moved me. Sparked that off. I think RPGs. I think I mentioned RPGs at the very end of the blurb by kind of Alison shouting at me until I did. But we haven't had time to discuss them. But I think there might be, when we definitely run Punctuation 2. I think I might pitch this, but with RPGs instead of board games. Pat or Andrew, did you have anything to add on kind of being moved by games, or fair enough?
I've learned stuff from games, but I don't think that sort of that sort of deep emotional change, not really.
Okay. I have sometimes cackled with glee about a game doing something. Like if something really strikes me as clever, I've laughed out loud at a game mechanic before. That happens, especially in Arkham Horror, where they twist the mechanics in really interesting ways.
Yeah.
No, I'm not talking rubbish. Werewolf and Villagers, of course, those have impacted me. You know, those sort of very social games where you're playing with. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but they just came back to me. Those very sort of social games where they're all about social, and you know, I find them a very useful way of getting to know people. You know, so yes. Yeah. Sorry.
No. So, does anyone else have any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
That was
excellent.
Are you there
yet? My closing thought is that I want more Euro games that tell a story like Pandemic Legacy does. But the reason why I picked up Seventh Continent was on my quest to find something that has Euro-like mechanics that also had a strong narrative element. But I've not found one that I've gelled with beyond Pandemic Legacy.
Yeah. I think I want to go with the close that I think is really important, which is these might not be games that you want to play. Games are for everybody, and that's fine. And John sort of touched on this. If this isn't the kind of thing that isn't your kind of game, that's absolutely fine. There's something out there. And part of being a gamer is not saying, go away, this is our house. It's saying, like, come on in, the water's lovely. And I think, again, as somebody who teaches games, that's so important to me to kind of make the point that, yeah, sure, we talked about something that we're really kind of passionate about, but other games are available and you don't have to role play everything. You don't even have to role play these games. You know, I think Andrew's kind of talked about that as well. Like, you can just play them completely statistically. That's fine. Like, you know, you do you. Like, yeah.
And the other half of this is that whatever sort of game you like, there's going to be not just one, but probably dozens of them. You know, for you. There's
absolutely,
huge variety. You know.
Yeah. No. Yay.
So I have one closing thought, which is, I love Arkham Horror, the card game. It's so good. I would highly recommend it to everyone. I have played it 200 times, and I show no sign of getting bored with it. I've definitely got my money's worth.
I have no idea how many cards I have. I have all the cards except one expansion, which is very annoying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
But there's a panel now about playing RPGs for different audiences, which I suspect we have crossover with. So go forth to the program and we'll see you all in that panel. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.